Part 5. Katorga. Chapter 1. The Doomed. Revolution is often rash in its generosity. It is such a hurry to disown so much. Take the word katorga, for instance. Now, katorga is a good word, a word with some weight in it. It means hard labor, or penal servitude, and it was in use during the time of the Tsars. Katorga descends from the judicial bench like a blade of a guillotine, stops short of beheading the prisoner but breaks his spine, shatters all hope there is, and then in the courtroom. Stalin was very fond of old words, and 26 years after the February Revolution had abolished katorga, Stalin reintroduced it. Little attempt was made to conceal the purpose of these katorga camps. The katorzhane were to be done to death. These were, undisguisedly, murder camps. But in the Gulag tradition, murder was protracted, so that the doomed would suffer longer and put in a little work before they died. They were housed in tents, 7 meters by 20, of the kind common in the north. Surrounded with boards and sprinkled with sawdust, the tent became a sort of flimsy hut. It was meant to hold 80 people, if they were on bunk beds, or 100 on sleeping platforms. But katorzhane were put into them 200 at a time. Yet there was no reduction in average living space, just a rational utilization of accommodation. The katorzhane were put on a 12-hour working day with 2 shifts and no rest days, so that there were always 100 at work and 100 in the hut. At work they were cordoned off by guards with dogs, beaten whenever anyone felt like it, urged on to greater efforts by Tommy guns. On their way back to the living area, their ranks might be raked with Tommy gun fire for no good reason, and the soldiers would not have to answer for the casualties. Even at a distance, a column of exhausted katorzhane was easily identified. No ordinary prisoners dragged themselves so hopelessly, so painfully along. Their 12 working hours were measured out in full to the last tedious minute. Those quarrying stone for road making in the polar blizzards of Norilsk were allowed 10 minutes for a warm-up once in the course of a 12-hour shift. And then their 12-hour rest was wasted in the silliest way imaginable. Part of these 12 hours went into moving them from one camp area to another, parading them, searching them. Once in the living area, they were immediately taken into a tent, which was never ventilated, a windowless hut, and locked in. In winter, a foul, sour stench hung so heavy in the damp air that no one unused to it could endure it for 2 minutes. The living area was even less accessible to the katorzhane than the camp work area. They were never allowed to go to the latrine, nor to the mess hut, nor to the medical section. All their needs were served by the latrine bucket and the feeding hatch. Such was Stalin's katorga as it took shape in 1943 to 1944, a combination of all that was worst in the camps with all that was worst in the prisons. Their 12 hours of rest also included inspections, morning and evening, a full and formal roll call. Then again, food was distributed twice in the course of these 12 hours. Mess tins were passed through the feeding hatch, and through the feeding hatch they were collected again. According to the camp records, which were not meant to preserve for history the fact that the political prisoners were also starved to death, they were entitled to supplementary miners' rations and bonus dishes, which were miserable enough even before 3 lots of thieves got at them. This was another lengthy procedure conducted through the feeding hatch. Names were called out one by one, and dishes exchanged for coupons. And when at last you were about to collapse onto the sleeping platform and fall asleep, the hatch would drop again. Once again, names were called, and they would start reissuing the same coupons for use the next day. So out of the 12 leisure hours in the cell, barely 4 remained for undisturbed sleep. Then again, katorzhane were of course paid no money, nor had they any right to receive parcels or letters. The katorzhane responded nicely to this treatment and quickly died. But I can already hear angry cries from my compatriots and contemporaries. Stop! Who are these people of whom you dare to speak? Yes, they were to be destroyed, and rightly so. Why, these were traitors, police, burgomasters. They got what they asked for. Surely you are not sorry for them? And the women there were German bedstraw. I hear women's voices crying. First, a few words about our women. Did the whole world of literature, before Stalin, rapturously proclaim that love could not be contained by national boundaries, by the will of generals and diplomats? But once again we have adopted Stalin's yardstick. Except as decreed by the Supreme Soviet, thou shalt not mate. Your body is, first and foremost, the property of the fatherland. Before we go any further, how old were these women when they closed with the enemy in bed instead of in battle? Certainly under 30, and often no more than 25, which means that from their first childhood impression onward they had been educated after the October Revolution, been brought up in Soviet schools and on Soviet ideology, so that our anger was for the work of our own hands. Some of these girls had taken to heart what we had tirelessly dinned into them for 15 years on end, that there was no such thing as one owns country, that the fatherland is a reactionary fiction. Others had grown a little bored with our puritanical Lenten fare of meetings, conferences, and demonstrations, of films without kisses and dancing at arm's length. And yet others were simply hungry. Yes, hungry, in the most primitive sense. They had nothing to put in their bellies. But who is to really blame for all this? Who, I ask you? Those women? Or fellow countrymen, contemporaries, we ourselves, all of us? What was it in us that made the occupying troops much more attractive to our women? Was this not one of the innumerable penalties which we are continually paying, and will be paying for a long time yet, for the path we so hastily chose and have so stumblingly followed, with never a look back at our losses, never a cautious look ahead? All right then, but the men at least were in for good reasons. They were traitors to their country and to their class. Since we have begun, let us go on. What about the school teachers? Those whom our army in its panicky recoil abandoned with their schools and pupils for a year, for 2 years, or even 3. The quartermasters had been stupid, the generals no good, so what must the teachers do now? Teach their children or not teach them? And what were the kids to do? Not kids of 15 who could earn a wage or join the partisans, but the little kids. Learn their lessons or live like sheep for 2 or 3 years to atone for the Supreme Commander's mistakes? If Daddy doesn't give you a cap, you let your ears freeze. Is that it? For some reason, no such question ever arose, either in Denmark or in Norway or in Belgium or in France. In those countries it was not felt that a people placed under German rule by its own foolish government, or by force of overwhelming circumstances, must thereupon stop living altogether. In those countries schools went on working, as did railways and local government. Somebody's brains, theirs of course, are 180 degrees out of true. Because in our country teachers received anonymous letters from the partisans. Don't dare teach, you will be made to pay for it. Working on the railways also became collaboration with the enemy. As for participation in the local administration, that was treason, unprecedented in its enormity. Everybody knows that a child who once drops out of school may never return to it. Just because the greatest strategic genius of all times and all nations had made a blooper, was the grass to wither till he righted it, or could it keep growing? Should children be taught in the meantime, or shouldn't they? Of course, a price would have to be paid. Pictures of the big mustache would have to be taken out of school, and pictures of the little mustache perhaps brought in. The children would gather round the tree at Christmas instead of New Year's, and at this ceremony, as also on some imperial anniversaries substituted for that of the October Revolution, the headmaster would have to deliver a speech in praise of the splendid new life, however bad things really were. But similar speeches have been made in the past, and life had been just as bad then. Or rather, you had to be more of a hypocrite before, had to tell the children many more lies, because the lies had had time to mature, and to permeate the syllabus in versions painstakingly elaborated by experts on teaching technique and by school inspectors. In every lesson, whether it was pertinent or not, whether you were studying the anatomy of worms or the use of conjunctions in complete sentences, you were required to take a kick at God, even if you yourself believed in him. You could not omit singing the praises of our boundless freedom, even if you had lain awake expecting a knock in the night. Whether you were reading Turgenev to the class or tracing the course of the Dnieper with your ruler, you had to anathematize the poverty-stricken past and hymn our present plenty, though long before the war you and the children had watched whole villages dying of hunger, and in the towns a child's ration had been 300 grams. None of this was considered a sin against the truth, against the soul of the child, or against the Holy Ghost. Whereas now, under the temporary and still unsettled occupation regime, far fewer lies had to be told. But they stood the old ones on their heads. That was the trouble. So it was that the voice of the fatherland and the pencil of the underground party committee forbade you to teach children their native language, geography, arithmetic, and science. 20 years of katorga for work of that sort. Fellow countrymen, nod your heads in agreement. There they go, guards with dogs alongside, marching to the barracks with their night pails. Stone them. They taught your children. But my fellow countrymen, particularly former members of the specially privileged government departments, retired on pension at 45, advance me on with raised fists. Who is it that I am defending? Those who served the Germans as burgomasters, as village headmen, as police, as interpreters, all kinds of filth and scum? Well, let us go a little deeper. We have done far too much damage by looking at people as entries in a table. Whether we like it or not, the future will force us to reflect on the reasons for their behavior. When they started playing and singing Let Noble Rage, what spine did not tingle? Our natural patriotism, long banned, howled down, under fire, anathematized, was suddenly permitted, encouraged, praised as sacred. What Russian heart did not leap up, swell with grateful longing for unity? How could we, with our natural magnanimity, help forgiving in spite of everything the native butchers as the foreign butchers drew near? Later, the need for drown half-conscious misgivings about our impulsive generosity made us all the more unanimous and violent in cursing the traitors, people plainly worse than ourselves, people incapable of forgiveness. Russia has stood for 11 centuries, known many foes, waged many wars. But have there been many traitors in Russia? Did traitors ever leave the country in crowds? I think not. I do not think that even their foes ever accused the Russians of being traitors, turncoats, renegades, though they lived under a regime inimical to ordinary working people. Then came the most righteous war in our history. To a country with a supremely just social order, and tens of hundreds of thousands of our people stood revealed as traitors. Where did they all come from, and why? Perhaps the unextinguished embers of the Civil War had flared up again. Perhaps these were whites who had not escaped extermination. No. I had mentioned before that many white emigres took sides with the Soviet Union and against Hitler. They had freedom of choice, and that is what they chose. These tens and hundreds of thousands, police and executioners, headmen and interpreters, were all ordinary Soviet citizens. And there were many young people among them who had grown up since the revolution. What made them do it? What sort of people were they? For the most part, people who had fallen, themselves and their families, under the caterpillar tracks of the 20s and 30s. People who had lost parents, relatives, loved ones in the turbid streams of our sewage system, or who themselves had time and again sunk and struggled to the surface in the camps and places of banishment. People who knew well enough what it was to stand with feet numb and frostbitten in the queue at the parcels window. People who in those cruel decades had found themselves severed, brutally cut off from the most precious thing on earth, the land itself, though it had been promised to them, incidentally, by the great decree of 1917, and though they had been called upon to shed their blood for it in the Civil War. Quite another matter are the country residences bought and bequeathed by Soviet officers, the fenced-in manorial domains outside Moscow. That's ours, so it's all right. Then some people had been seized for snipping ears of wheat or rye, and some deprived of the right to live where they wished, or the right to follow a long-practiced and well-loved trade. No one now remembers how fanatically we persecuted craftsmen. All such people are spoken of nowadays, especially by the professional agitators and the proletarian vigilantes of October, with a contemptuous compression of the lips, people with a grudge against the Soviet state, formerly repressed persons, sons of the former kulak class, people secretly harboring black resentment of the Soviet power. One says it, and another nods his head, as though it explained anything, as though the people's state had the right to offend its citizens, as though this were the essential defect, the root of the evil. People with a grudge, secretly resentful. And no one cries out, "How can you? Damn your insolence! Do you or do you not hold that being determines consciousness? Or only when it suits you, and when it doesn't suit you does it cease to be true?" Then again, some of us are very good at saying, and a shadow flits over our faces, well, yes, certain errors were committed. Always the same disingenuously innocent, impersonal form. Were committed. Only nobody knows by whom. You might also think that it was by ordinary workers, by men who shift heavy loads, by collective farmers. Nobody has the courage to say, "The party committed them. Our irremovable and irresponsible leaders committed them." Yet by whom, except those who had power, could such errors be committed? Lump all the blame on Stalin? Have you no sense of humor? If Stalin committed all these errors, where were you at the time, you ruling millions? In any case, even these mistakes have faded into our eyes to a dim, shapeless blur, and they are no longer regarded as the result of stupidity, fanaticism, and malice. They are all subsumed in the only mistake acknowledged, that communists jailed communists. If 15 to 17 million peasants were ruined, sent off for destruction, scattered about the country without the right to remember their parents or mention them by name, that was apparently no mistake. And all the tributary streams of the sewage system surveyed at the beginning of this book were also, it seems, no mistake. That they were utterly unprepared for war with Hitler, emptily vainglorious, that they retreated shamefully, changing their slogans as they ran, that only Ivan fighting for Holy Russia halted the Germans on the Volga, all this turns out to be not a silly blunder, but possibly Stalin's greatest achievement. In the space of 2 months, we abandoned very nearly 1/3 of our population to the enemy, including all those incompletely destroyed families, including camps with several thousand inmates, who scattered as soon as their guards ran for it, including prisons in the Ukraine and the Baltic states, where smoke still hung in the air after mass shooting of political prisoners. As long as we were strong, we smothered these unfortunates, hounded them, denied them work, drove them from their homes, hurried them into their graves. When our weakness was revealed, we immediately demanded that they should forget all the harm done them, forget the parents and the children who had died of hunger in the tundra, forget the executions, forget how he ruined them, forget our ingratitude to them, forget interrogation and torture at the hands of the NKVD, forget the starvation camps, and immediately join the partisans, go underground to defend the homeland, with no thought for their lives. There was no need for us to change, and no one held out the hope that when we came back we should treat them any differently, no longer hounding, harassing, jailing, and shooting them. Given this state of affairs, should we be surprised that too many people welcomed the arrival of the Germans, or surprised that there were so few who did? And the believers? For 20 years on end, religious belief was persecuted and churches closed down. The Germans came, and the churches began to open their doors. Our masters lacked the nerve to shut them down again immediately after the German withdrawal. In Rostov-on-the-Don, for instance, the ceremonial opening of the churches was an occasion for mass rejoicing and great crowds gathered. Were they nonetheless supposed to curse the Germans for this? In Rostov again, in the first days of the war, Alexander Petrovich, M., an engineer, was arrested and died in a cell under interrogation. For several anxious months his wife expected to be arrested herself. Only when the Germans came could she go to bed with a quiet mind. Now at least I can have some sleep. Should she instead have prayed for the return of her tormentors? In May 1943, while the Germans were in Vinitsa, men digging in an orchard on the Poslanaya Street, which the city's Soviet had surrounded with a high fence early in 1939 and declared a restricted area under the People's Commissariat of Defense, found themselves uncovering graves which had previously escaped notice because they were overgrown with luxuriant grass. They found 39 mass graves, 3.5 meters deep, 3 meters wide, 4 meters long. In each grave they found a first layer of outer garments belonging to the deceased, then bodies laid alternately head first or feet first. The hands of all of them were tied with rope, and they had all been shot by small-bore pistols in the back of the head. They had evidently been executed in prison and carted out for burial by night. Documents which had not decayed made it possible to identify people who had been sentenced to 20 years without the right to correspond in 1938. One picture of the excavation site. Inhabitants of Vinitsa have come here to view the bodies or identify their relatives. There was more to come. In June they began digging near the Orthodox cemetery, outside the Pirogov Hospital, and discovered another 42 graves. Next, the Gorky Park of Culture and Rest, where, under the swings and carousel, the fun house, the games area, and the dance floor, 14 more mass graves were found. Altogether, 9,439 corpses in 95 graves. This was in Vinitsa alone, and the discoveries were accidental. How many lie successfully hidden in other towns? After viewing these corpses, were the population supposed to rush off and join the partisans? Perhaps in fairness we should at least admit that if you and I suffer when we and all we hold dear are trodden underfoot, those we tread on feel no less pain. Perhaps in fairness we should at least admit that those whom we seek to destroy have a right to hate us. Or have they no such right? Are they supposed to die gratefully? We attribute deep-seated, if not indeed congenital malice to these polizei, these burgomasters, but we ourselves planted their malice in them. They were waste products of our making. How does Krylenko's dictum go? In our eyes, every crime is the product of a particular social system. In this case, of your system, comrades. Don't forget your own doctrine. Let us not forget either that among those of our fellow countrymen who took up the sword against us or attacked us in words, some were completely disinterested. No property had been taken from them. They had none to begin with. They had never been imprisoned in the camps, nor yet had any of their kin. But they had long ago been sickened by our whole system, its contempt for the fate of the individual, the persecution of people for their beliefs, that cynical song, "There's no land where men can breathe so freely," the kowtowing of the devout to the leader, the nervous twitching of pencils as everyone hurries to sign up for the state loan, the obligatory applause rising to an ovation. Cannot we realize that these perfectly normal people could not breathe our fetid air? Father Fyodor Floria's accusers asked him how he had dared talk about Stalin's foul deeds when the Romanians were on the spot. "How could I say anything different about you?" he answered. "I only told them what I knew. I only told them what had happened. What we ask is something different. Lie. Go against your conscience. Perish, just so long as it helps us. But this, unless I'm mistaken, is hardly materialism." Mankind is almost incapable of dispassionate, unemotional thinking. In something which he has recognized as evil, man can seldom force himself to see also what is good. Not everything in our lives was foul, not every word in the papers was false, but the minority, downtrodden, bullied, beset by stool pigeons, saw life in our country as an abomination from top to bottom, saw every page in the newspapers as one long lie. We have been talking about the towns, but we should not forget the countryside. Liberals nowadays commonly reproach the village with its political obtusiveness and conservatism, but before the war the village, to a man, or overwhelmingly, was sober, much more sober than the town. It took no part at all in the deification of Daddy Stalin, and, needless to say, had no time for the world revolution either. The village was, quite simply, sane and remembered clearly how it had been promised land, then robbed of it, how it had lived, eaten, and dressed before and after collectivization, how calves, ewes, and even hens had been taken away from the peasant's yard, how churches had been desecrated and defiled. Even in 1941 the radio's nasal bray was not yet heard in peasant huts, and not every village had even one person able to read the newspapers. So that to the Russian countryside all those Chang So-lins, MacDonalds, and Hitlers were indistinguishably strange and meaningless lay figures. In a village in Ryazan province on July 3, 1941, peasants gathered near the smithy were listening to Stalin's speech relayed by a loudspeaker. The man of iron, hitherto unmoved by the tears of Russian peasants, was now a bewildered old gaffer almost in tears himself, and as soon as he blurted out his humbugging brothers and sisters, one of the peasants answered the black paper mouthpiece. "This is what you want, you bastard!" And he made in the direction of the loudspeaker a rude gesture much favored by Russians. One hand grips the opposite elbow, and the forearm rises and falls in a pumping motion. The peasants all roared with laughter. If we questioned eyewitnesses in every village, we should learn of the 10,000 such incidents, some still more pungent. Such was the mood of the Russian village at the beginning of the war. The mood, then, of the reservists drinking the last half-liter and dancing in the dust with their kinsmen while they waited at some wayside halt for a train. On top of all of this came a defeat without precedent in Russian memories, as vast rural areas stretching to the outskirts of both capitals and to the Volga, as many millions of peasants slipping from under Kolka's rule, and, why go on lying and prettifying history? It turned out that the republics only wanted independence. The village only wanted freedom from the Kolkas. The workers' freedom from feudal decrees. But now, since further postponement is impossible, should I not also talk about those who even before 1941 had only one dream, to take up arms and blaze away at those red commissars, Chekists, and collectivizers? Remember Lenin's words. An oppressed class which did not aspire to possess arms and learn how to handle them would deserve only to be treated as slaves. There is, then, reason to be proud if the Soviet-German war showed that we are not such slaves as all those studies by liberal historians contemptuously make us out to be. There was nothing slavish about those who reached for their sabers to cut off Daddy Stalin's head, nor about those on the other side who straightened their backs for the first time when they put on the Red Army greatcoats, in a strange brief interval of freedom which no student of society could have foreseen. These people, who had experienced on their own hides 24 years of communist happiness, knew by 1941 what as yet no one else in the world knew, that nowhere on the planet, nowhere in history, Was there a regime more vicious, more bloodthirsty, and at the same time more cunning and ingenious than the Bolshevik, the self-styled Soviet regime? That no other regime on earth could compare it with either in the number of those it had done to death, in hardiness, in the range of its ambitions, in its thoroughgoing and unmitigated totalitarianism. No, not even the regime of its pupil Hitler, which at the time blinded Western eyes to all else. Came the time when weapons were put in the hands of these people. Should they have curbed their passions, allowed Bolshevism to outlive itself, steeled themselves to cruel oppression again, and only then begun the struggle with it? A struggle which has still hardly started anywhere in the world. No, the natural thing was to copy the methods of Bolshevism itself. It had eaten into a body of Russia sapped by the First World War, and it must be defeated at a similar moment in the Second. The Germans were met with bread and salt in the villages on the Don. The pre-1941 population of the Soviet Union naturally imagined that the coming of a foreign army meant the overthrow of the communist regime. Otherwise, it could have no meaning for us at all. People expected a political program which would liberate them from Bolshevism. From where we were, separated from them by the wilderness of Soviet propaganda, by the dense mass of Hitler's army, how could we readily believe that the Western Allies had entered this war not for the sake of freedom in general, but for their own Western European freedom, only against Nazism, intending to take full advantage of the Soviet armies and leave it at that? Was it not more natural for us to believe that our allies were true to the very principle of freedom, and that they would not abandon us to a worse tyranny? True, these were the same allies for whom Russians had died in the First World War, and who then, too, hastening back to their comforts. But this was a lesson too cruel for the heart to learn. Even in 1943, tens of thousands of refugees from the Soviet provinces trailed along behind the retreating German army. Anything was better than remaining under communism. I will go so far as to say that our folk would have been worth nothing at all, a nation of abject slaves, if it had gone through that war without brandishing a rifle at Stalin's government even from afar, if it had missed its chance to shake its fist and fling a ripe oath at the father of the peoples. The Germans had their generals' plot, but what did we have? Our generals were, and remain to this day, non-entities, corrupted by party ideology and greed, and have not preserved in their own persons the spirit of the nation, as happens in other countries. So that those who raised their hands and struck were almost to a man from the lowest levels of society. The number of former gentry emigres, former members of the wealthier strata, and intellectuals taking part was microscopically small. Chekhov complained that we had no legal definition of katorga, or of its purpose. But that was in the enlightened 19th century. In the middle of the 20th, the caveman century, we didn't even feel the need to understand and define. Old man Stalin had decided that it would be so, and that was all the definition necessary. We just nodded our heads in understanding. End of Part 5, Chapter 1.